So we've been in this series called First Things First. This is the final week in this series. We've been talking about spiritual practices for a digital age, a busy age, these things that can help us grow and be rooted in Jesus. Our goal, again, as disciples here is to pursue Jesus fully, love others deeply. And this portion is designed to help us figure out how to do that pursue Jesus fully part. What are the practices in our lives that help us pursue him fully? And so we've talked week 1 about the practice of word, week 2, the practice of prayer, the practice of community, week 3, and the practice of service in week 4, last week. But now this week, we're going to get into what is arguably the most awkward, most sensitive, and at times cringy practice to talk about. But I'm not going to tell you what it is yet. First, a story. Over 10 years ago, I was invited to a retreat in New Braunfels, at this camp in New Braunfels that was known for their high ropes course. Now, late high school and all through college, I did rock climbing, and so I was like, ropes and heights, absolutely, I'm in. In church, I'm here today to tell you that was a mistake. Totally different thing to do a high ropes course than rock climbing, where the face of the rock is in front of you and you can cling to it. And the creme de la creme of this camp, the signature experience there, was this experience called the Screamer. And what a screamer is that you put on this harness, this climbing harness and this helmet, and you walk up this huge flight of stairs high above the mountains of New Braunfels. And there in that mountainous air, you walk out on this platform suspended over the city, and you sit down on this platform. And a guy comes up and locks you in from behind, and then they grab this steel cable that's under tension, and they snap it into the front of your harness, and instantly you feel your entire body surge forward. And the idea is that they will release you and fling you high over the mountains of New Braunfels for the time of your life. Except in that moment, that in-between liminal space, where you're feeling the tension of all of this force ready to fling you out, and you're just hearing the words of this guy behind you say, "Don't worry, I've got you." This battle between your brain and your body begins. And I'm sitting there clinging to that platform. Because for all of my life, my body has been taught that when you're on the edge of a precipice, feeling like you're going to fall, you hold on. Except there's this voice behind me saying, "You can let go." And this battle begins. And the irony is that I've climbed to this point, overseeing all of the glory of New Braunfels for this experience that is to be incredible. But in order to have this great joy of being flung out into space, I must be willing to let go of this lesser joy. And I struggled to do it. It seems to me that in Matthew chapter 6, when Jesus was having a conversation with his disciples, he was trying to point us to a greater joy. He was trying to point us to a greater kingdom and a greater treasure, but the problem is he knows that we cling to the lesser. And so in Matthew 6, Jesus begins this conversation with his disciples about which we will treasure, calling us to treasure the greater. But in order to treasure the greater, we must be willing to let go of the lesser. Jesus wants to have a conversation with us about the kingdom and treasure. Jesus wants to have a conversation with us about money. And we find it in Matthew chapter 6. So grab your Bibles and meet me there in Matthew chapter 6. Because Jesus wants to talk about the devotion of our hearts. And in Matthew chapter 6, there before his disciples, Jesus would say this. Verse 19, Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is a lamp of the body, so if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. And if then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Jesus is gathered with his disciples on a mountain. It's a sermon on the mount. And there the crowds have come, and he's teaching his disciples, his followers, what it means to be fully devoted to his kingdom. That's the word he uses in the passage, devoted. He wants to talk about our hearts and what we're devoted to. Verse 24, you see that word. And what he says is the reason we struggle being fully devoted to him and devoted to his kingdom and its treasure is because we struggle with this dual devotion. We struggle with a dual devotion. We want to be devoted to Jesus fully and pursue Jesus fully, but our problem is our hearts are also very devoted to what we're doing here on earth and what we possess or have. We're trying to hold on to two things, and Jesus says you cannot be devoted to both God and money. You cannot serve them both. Now, I get how this feels, a pastor talking about money, how cliche. And maybe this is your very first Sunday at Northeast, so hear me say this: I do not want anything from you this morning. But I get it. There's a bad rap. Pastors asking for money, this sense that God just wants our money. Well, let's just pause and unpack that for a little bit, this idea that God just wants my money. You're telling me the God of the universe, who spoke everything into existence with a mere word from his mouth, this God who spoke all things, including gold and diamonds, that he wants your money? That this God who created all things, owns all things, is sovereign over all things, wants what you have, because somehow what you have is what he lacks, or he finds that what you have is better than what he already has. I mean, it seems to me that the God of all creation, if he really wanted money, he could just speak it. Now, Jesus is not talking about money because God wants your money. Jesus is speaking into this treasure that we hold on to called money because Jesus wants our hearts. And he knows the problem is that in order to get to our hearts, he's got to get past the thing that our hearts are tied around, the thing that our hearts treasure the most. And so Jesus addresses the heart. You see this in the first few verses there. He goes right after and says heart. Verses 19 to 21. Do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth, but rather lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart, underline it, will be also. Jesus is addressing what our hearts treasure. And do you see the contrast there? Heaven versus earth. He's creating a contrast. And he's saying that really we can only treasure one of those things. Jesus is doing an audit of our hearts. What do you treasure more? What do we treasure more? The things of earth or the things of heaven? Do you worry more late at night, lying awake, staring at that ceiling? Do you worry more about your bills and what you need in order to make it through the rest of the month? Or do you lie awake at night thinking about those family members who don't know Jesus and whether they ever will? What is it that we think about more? Do we spend more time in the month thinking about our expenses, or more time in the month thinking about those that we love who don't know Jesus? Jesus wants to audit our hearts. And an audit of mine and where my mind goes in this season is leaning a lot more to the treasures of earth than it is the treasures of heaven. And Jesus wants to get my heart. See, one is earthly, one is eternal, and Jesus is trying to point us to the greater thing. And so he says, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. That phrase, lay up, means to store up or to save up. It's a picture of what we hold on to. It's a picture of where we find our security. Now, please understand in this that Jesus is not dissing saving. He's not saying you shouldn't save, you should be fiscally irresponsible and just give it all away. That is not at all what Jesus is saying, nor what the scriptures say. The scriptures call us to be wise stewards, to save. But what Jesus is really trying to get at is not saving, it's security. Where do you find your security? And do you find your security in what you've saved here? Or do you find your security in the one who saves? Proverbs 21:20 says, the wise store up choice food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down. It's a picture of saving, and there's wisdom in saving, Proverbs says. But Proverbs also says, Proverbs 11:24, one gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. Withholding what he should give but only suffers want. It's that picture of that person who's holding on to what they have and doesn't want to be generous in this life that Jesus has called us to. And yet Jesus paints this picture, the scriptures paint this picture, that to just hold on means that you're always wanting more. It doesn't work to find your security in stuff here because it's going to rot, it's going to rust, and the more you hold on to it, the more it slips out, and the more you keep pining for. It's a picture of security. It's a picture of where our treasure is, and Jesus is calling us to lay up our treasures in heaven. Well, what does that mean, to lay up treasures in heaven? Quite simply, it's a call to invest ourselves in God's kingdom. Invest ourselves in his work, what he's doing. It's a call to invest ourselves in the body and the bride, the church of Jesus Christ. The question is, are we helping advance God's kingdom? Are we helping advance what Jesus is doing in the world? And Jesus isn't just talking here about time that you give to the church or energies that you give, like volunteering. Those are absolutely necessary. But Jesus is pushing beyond just that because he literally ends by saying the word money. Jesus wants to know, do you value the kingdom enough to help it expand? And this thing that you say has benefited you and helped you and saved you, are you committed enough to that you want it to benefit others too? So lay up, invest in the kingdom of heaven. I grew up as a missionary kid, and I was very much aware that we were living on other people's generosity. As a missionary kid, my parents felt the call to go to South America, and they picked us up and we moved, but we only did so because of the generosity of those who gave. There were churches in Canada that gave so that my parents could go and preach the gospel in South America. This is why you don't want to invade Canada, because they're really good people, okay? Saying. Hi, Mom and Dad, who are likely watching online today because it got snowed in Canada. Love you. Churches in Canada gave so that my parents could go. And I knew this, I sensed this deeply because every couple of years we would come back, stateside we called it, and we would be toured around to all of these churches, and we'd be put up on the stage, and my parents would give this presentation, and we'd smile and put up with all the, wow, you've really grown comments. And these churches would then see us and be reminded of the mission and be reminded to be generous so that my parents could do more of what God has called them to do. But God called them to do that, and they could only do it because of the generosity. Jesus is calling, answer. They could only do that because of the generosity of those in Canada who gave. And here's what the gospel says, that those in Canada who gave shared in the reward of what my parents did in South America. when they helped plant churches, when they helped spread the gospel, and people came to know Jesus and were invited and welcomed into this kingdom, people in Canada shared in that reward because they gave. When churches were planted and expanded and families came in and marriages were restored, people in Canada received credit for that work, though they hadn't done it personally with their hands. What Jesus is saying is less about what I want from you and more what he wants for you, that we get to share in a global work, and we get to share in lives that are transformed and marriages that are reconciled, and we get to share in churches that are planted and people across continents coming to faith in him. We share in the reward when we lay up treasures in heaven. And so Jesus says, where your heart is there, or where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, verse 21. Meaning our hearts go where our wallets lead them. So if we want to grow deeper in our love for God, we want to pursue Jesus more fully, that means we bring all of ourselves to him, including what we own. What Jesus is really saying here is painting a picture of what maturity looks like and how money influences it. Saying in a roundabout way that your money influences your spiritual maturity. Either for good or for ill, your money can influence your spiritual maturity. Because where your treasure is, there your heart will be. So if you're putting treasure and investing in God's kingdom, your heart goes there and it grows you. Your money has an absolute definitive connection to your maturity. Being generous towards others, being generous in the kingdom grows your heart for the kingdom. But being stingy about the kingdom, looking at this only as yours and holding on to it for yourself, stunts your maturity. Think about it this way. If you came to me and you said to me, I love my family. I love my kids. No one in my life is more important than my kids. I treasure them above all else. And yet, as I observed your family, I noticed that you refused to buy them new shoes. You complained every time they asked for school supplies. And you bemoaned the fact that they were costing you so much money when you went to the grocery store. Do you know how much eggs cost? If that was your response to your kids, that you begrudged the idea of providing for them what they needed, then I would absolutely question your words to me that you loved your kids above all else. I think you might love eggs more. The reality is we so often come into this place and we say, I love Jesus more than anything else. I love the kingdom more than anything else. This has transformed my life. Nothing is more important to me. And then when the pastor gets up and has a conversation about money, we begrudge it. And Jesus is saying, then I kind of wonder if the treasure of your heart is really in heaven. Because it seems to me that maybe the treasure of your heart is here on earth. So this is what Jesus goes on to kind of prove out, this idea of money being connected to maturity in verses 22 to 23. He says, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye's healthy, here's the maturing, healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light is in you, is darkness, how great is the darkness? When I first read this passage, I was so confused about it. I was like, why is Jesus one moment talking about kingdom and treasure and money, and then the next minute, lamps and eyes and darkness? But Jesus is using a metaphor. In the same way that we need light to walk through a room without tripping or stumbling in the dark, Jesus is saying your eye is what provides light so that you can see and walk clearly. We need light in a dark room so that we can walk clearly. And you need good sight in order to walk clearly through life. But if you have bad eyes, if you don't see the world right, if your vision is dark, then you won't walk clearly. Some of us struggle to see naturally. So when my wife comes out and asks me if she looks good in an outfit and I don't have my glasses on, I'm like, sure. Jesus is speaking about a spiritual condition of the heart where our eyes are glazed over because of treasure. And as a result, because we view the most important things in life as being here, he says we walk and we're unclear. We're walking in the dark. Our eyes are bad. See, when you view the things on earth as being the most important, when you view the things that you own, the car that you drive, the neighborhood that you live in, the stuff that you have or get to do on the weekends, when you view that as the be-all, end-all, and that's what defines me, and that's where status is, and that's what I need to have, when you view earthly things with that kind of priority, Jesus says, you're not walking clearly. You won't walk clearly through life because you are seeing it wrong. The earthly is not eternal. He's already said it will rot and it will rust. But if you rightly see the eternal, then it rightly places everything else in perspective. Generosity will either drive your heart to heaven or greed will pull it away. Because how you use your money influences your maturity. It influences your sight. And so Jesus concludes with this verse 24, that no one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Jesus is talking about devotion. Again, underline that word there in the text. He wants to know, and he's doing an audit of our hearts. What are you more devoted to? Which kingdom are you more devoted to? And he says only one can rule our hearts. The problem is we don't believe Jesus. We actually think and act and live as though we know better than Jesus. When it comes to this, we look at it and we say, I don't think that's true. Lord, I think I can balance this. I can balance it okay, and I can still have all the things and still treasure you most. And so we look at it as though I've got two hands, and so Lord, I can absolutely treasure the kingdom as long as the kingdom hand is a little bit higher than the earthly hand, then I'm living rightly with you first. And I'm holding these things rightly in balance and in perspective. Except the problem is Jesus isn't talking about two hands. What part of the body is Jesus talking about in the text? Jesus is talking about one heart. And you don't have two. And with your one heart, Jesus is asking, what is it more devoted to? So Jesus calls our hearts to be fully devoted to him. In this, what Jesus is saying is, hey, generosity, your willingness to be generous, to expand the kingdom is a litmus test of what you trust, what we trust. Generosity is a litmus test of what we trust. It shows and proves out whether we really trust him and we're willing to live for the kingdom, or whether we trust in what we have and what we've built and what we hold on to. Word litmus test isn't a word that we use a ton anymore. I don't know if you remember back to science class and litmus tests when you were learning about acidity and alkaline and the difference between good or bad water. Or if you own a pool, right, and you do these little tests for the pH balance to determine what kind of chemicals it needs so that you can swim in it. In middle school, we did these tests and we got these little paper strips. And we would dip it into the water, and the strip of paper would turn a color and tell us if that water was too acidic or basic alkaline, right? Is it bad to drink or good to drink? Is my pool good to swim in? If so, call me in June. Is it not? Right? This litmus test of our hearts, Jesus is saying, is this thing called generosity. We dip it in your heart, and we test whether you're willing to be generous to Jesus in the way that he's been generous to you. And that kind of shows where your heart is. It shows what's in there. It shows who you're really serving. It shows what you're really devoted to. It's a litmus test of what we treasure. And because it's a litmus test of what we treasure and what we trust, Jesus is calling us then to budget according to that value. We should budget according to our values. The problem in the church for followers of Jesus is that we do that. We actually do budget according to our values. The problem is our values are wrong. We don't value the kingdom enough. Jesus is saying, no, you need to value the kingdom and then budget according to your values. We all budget according to our values. You have exactly what God intended you to have, and you're spending it on exactly what you want to spend it on, right? You are budgeting according to your values, where you live, the car you drive, the clothes you wear. You budget and you make decisions based on your values. Jesus is just asking the question, am I one of those values? And so Jesus is asking us, using generosity as this litmus test, do you trust me? Do you value my kingdom? See, each and every month at Northeast, we get to invest in others. Each and every month at Northeast, we help people out. We have this thing called a benevolence fund, which is a fancy Christian word for just saying, we love you. And this benevolence fund is designed to help people when they're in times of need or crisis. So if you lose a job or if there's this thing that happens maybe medically in your life and you don't know if you can keep the lights on this month because all the other bills have hit at the same time, that's a fund designed for you. And you can come to us and we can help you. And each and every month we help people keep lights on and we put food on the table and we help them make it another month while they're in the midst of a job search because they got laid off. And each and every month, we help people, and if you give to Northeast, you share in the reward and you get credit. Each and every month, we help missionaries stay on the mission field. Each and every month, we make sure that they can keep preaching the gospel and keep focused on the work that God has called them to do. And each and every month, lives are transformed and marriages are reconciled and more churches are planted and you share in that reward. If you give to God's kingdom, Jesus is asking this question, will you give to the kingdom? So what do we do with this? The question each week that we've asked and then tried to apply in a very practical way is this: what do we do with this? What is Jesus asking us to do? And as we've asked you very practically each week to take a step, so too this week I'm going to ask you practically to take a step. And the question then is the gospel a line item in your budget? Is the gospel a line item in your budget? Do you treasure the kingdom enough to say, I want to invest, I want to help expand the kingdom because I believe that it was essential for me and I know it's essential for others too? Is the gospel a line item in your budget? Most people budget around everything else first, and then they come into church and they hear the pastor talk about money and they're like, oh, well, I don't have any left. But maybe next month. And what the scriptures say is that we actually need to live a little different. The scriptures point us to this thing called the principle of firsts. There was the firstborn that was to be consecrated to God. There was the first fruits that were to be given to God as an offering. And in that vein, there was the first fruits, even of our income, a tithe that we were to give to the Lord. That word tithe you may view as an Old Testament only thing, except here's the thing. Paul in the New Testament writes to the church in Corinth and encourages them in this thing. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. Here's what Paul says. Now, concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do on the first day of every week. Each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. Paul's giving guidance to New Testament church people like you and me about how to live rightly with our money so that we treasure the right thing with our hearts. I grew up in a Baptist tradition, and so I learned it through 3 principles, and they all start with a P. Because if they didn't all begin with the same letter, it wasn't a good sermon. And so I'm going to pass on to you what I was taught about how to live in a way where I treasure heaven more than earth. The first is that the scriptures call us and tell us that giving should be planned. Giving should be planned. That's the first P. That's what Paul's talking about. He's writing this letter, and the very reason he's writing this letter here in 1 Corinthians 16, and then he does it again in his second letter to the same church, 2 Corinthians chapter 8. The very reason he's even writing this is because he wants them to be ready. That's the very thing he says. I want you to be ready. So I want you to plan for this. The problem is we plan for everything else. We plan for where we're going to live. We plan for what we want to drive. We plan for groceries. We plan for date nights. Jesus is saying, will you plan for my kingdom? Paul calls us to plan. The second P is priority. Giving should be a priority. That's where Paul says, not just a plan, but plan that it's first. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside. First day, we can argue over what is the first day of the week and how do we be absolutely essential on this. I think Paul is less concerned with being super literal about that day, and he's more concerned with the fabric of our hearts. Have we made it a priority? Is Jesus first? And if we say Jesus is first with our lives, how is that reflected in our values and our budget? From a biblical perspective, again, we talk about this then being a percentage or proportional. Those are the P words for the last point. Giving should be proportional. Giving should be proportional, meaning that God is not going to judge your giving and your amount based on the income of the person sitting down the row from you. It's proportional to what you've been given. 2 Corinthians 8, he's talking to them, encouraging their giving, and he says you should give according to your means. Jesus is just looking at you and what he's given you, and he wants to know where your heart lies. And give in proportion to what he's given you. Again, Old Testament standard was a tenth, 10%. Some of you are like, 10%? Wow, Lord, that's a lot. Well, let me just flip the script for you and put this in perspective. We think it's a lot because we view 100% of what we make as ours. But the perspective of the gospel is this: 100% of who you are, 100% of the breaths that you take, 100% of the talents that you have, 100% of the job that you're in, and 100% of the income that comes from the job and the talents that God gave you, all comes from him. 100% of you is because of Jesus. And out of that 100%, Jesus says, here's the deal. I want you to keep 90, and I want you to invest the 10. Because in investing the 10, we're going to go reach more people together, and you're going to share in the reward. I think if someone came to you with an investment strategy and said, hey, this is going to be a 90-10 split, and you get to keep 90, you'd think that's a pretty good strategy. That's pretty generous. And that's what God has done for you, because he owns it all. But he wants your heart. And 10% may seem like a ton to start out with. So just start somewhere. That's where we begin this journey. When you come to faith, you just start and you just try to keep growing. And that's what the scriptures would encourage you to do. And so as we close, I'm going to encourage you and challenge you very practically to live this out. But here's the thing. I am not going to ask you this week to give to our church. I do not want your money. I'm going to ask you this week to invest in the kingdom and help us plant other churches. So I'm going to challenge you this week to be generous. Maybe you've never been generous in the kingdom. Maybe this is a brand new concept for you. Maybe you're generous regularly. And you give right at that amount and you know what it is and you're faithful. And if so, thank you. My family thanks you. I get to preach the gospel because you're generous. Thank you. But I'm going to push you one step further and say, would you now also be generous so that we can see more churches planted? And I'm going to challenge you to give to our church plants. We have a church plant fund. And this weekend, we are inviting you to participate in the work of Chad and in the work of Scott and Leah and send them out to see the kingdom increased and more churches planted so that Jesus' name goes places where you and I don't live. so that he might be known, lives might be transformed, marriages might be restored and renewed, and they might one day go on and plant churches of their own for the glory of God and the good of his kingdom. You scan that QR code. If you don't like QR codes or don't know how to work them, just write a check. If you don't know how to write a check because you're young, then you should know how to use a QR code. I don't know. Look, if you have questions, just come and ask. If you're confused, if you're struggling with the whole concept, look, there's grace here. Here's the bottom line. Jesus wants your heart. Jesus wants you invested in his kingdom so that you can get and share in the great reward of glory. We get to be a part. And what a gracious gift and invitation that is. Would you prayerfully this week consider how you might invest in Jesus' kingdom? Pray with me. Father God, I confess my own heart struggles to even have this conversation because I know how much I'm tied around the needs of today in my own life, how much this is exposed in my own soul of the things that I'm holding on to right now and the things that I'm struggling to trust you with. And so I pray first and foremost, God, your forgiveness and your changing and reshaping of my heart. Teach me to trust you more. And Father, teach us all. Lord, in your goodness and by your grace, through the power of your Holy Spirit, would you reveal the areas of our lives where we're holding on to too tightly and not trusting you? And would you teach us, Father, the very words that you spoke, that we can live with your kingdom first and trust you, that you will provide everything else that we need. So, Father, grow us in that way. Grow us in this gift of generosity that others may benefit by knowing you. And we ask it in Jesus' matchless and most holy name. And all God's people said.
If you want to talk to someone about a decision you've made, or let us know how God is moving through these messages, visit nebc.ch/contact. Be sure to stay connected with us throughout the week on social media or by subscribing to this weekly podcast. You can always stay up to date with information about what's going on here at Northeast by visiting nebc.ch/mobile or by subscribing to the Northeast News, our periodic newsletter that comes to your inbox to keep you in the know. Thanks for listening to today's message, and we hope that you join us as we continue to make disciples who pursue Jesus fully and love others deeply.